Hi everyone, my name is Leah Ryan and my partner Jacqueline Finnegan and I put together this presentation for this week's discussion on experimental research. Experimental research is a type of research that's used to predict and control a phenomena. It's an objective, systematic, controlled investigation. Experimental research examines the cause and effect of a chosen variable. In order for research to be considered experimental, the research must have three main characteristics. The first is a controlled manipulation of at least one treatment variable. This is referred to as an independent variable. The second is administration of the treatment to some of the subjects in the study, which is the experimental group, and not to others, which is the control group. The final criteria is that the selection of the subjects or assignment of these subjects to the groups is randomized. Well-designed experimental research studies have a high degree of precision, consistency, and sequestration of subjects from the influences that might affect research results. Experimental research is considered quantitative research because of the vigorous controls of variables. A study that produces measurable data related to a research question is considered quantitative. These types of studies are performed in a highly controlled environment. As previously mentioned, a control group and experimental group must be present. Experimental research is considered the most powerful method of quantitative research based on the strict criteria and minimal room for error. The purpose of experimental studies is to test the null hypothesis by applying an intervention only to the experimental subjects while maintaining control. This happens when the researcher refrains from applying the intervention to the control group. The effect of this intervention is then measured on a dependent variable. Occasionally, there is a null hypothesis. This is a statement that reports there is no statistical difference between the control and experimental research group. Among experimental research, there are different types of studies. The most common design is a pre-test, post-test control design. In this design, the researcher measures the dependent variables in the control and experimental group before the intervention is applied. Then, the researcher measures the dependent variable in both groups after the intervention is applied to the experimental group. Another common option is an experimental study with a post-test only. In this type of study, the researcher only measures the dependent variables in both groups after the implementation of the intervention to the experimental group. There's also a factorial design. This design tests for the cause and effect using two or more independent variables. This design investigates the relationship of two or more independent variables on the dependent variable. Lastly is the Solomon-4 group design. This is an alternative to the post-test. Only the control group takes the post-test, and they are allowed multiple attempts. Experimental research is an intensive process, but for the purpose of this presentation, we've broken down the process into 7 steps. The first step is identifying a research problem through the use of reviewing current literature. The researcher collects concepts from a clinical area of interest. After research collection, the researcher identifies a knowledge gap that can be investigated. Next, you identify the purpose of the study. Questions to be answered here are, why is the study being performed? Or what is the aim of the study? This leads to step 3, the research question. What does the researcher want to know? After creating the research question, the researcher moves on to identifying study design. In experimental research studies, the control and experimental groups must be established. Remember, these two groups are always randomized. Independent and dependent variables are stated in the study design, and then the hypothesis is stated. The hypothesis states the relationship between the variables within the specific population. Next, the researcher implements the study. This is where data collection happens. After collecting data, the information found is analyzed. Statistical tests of the researcher's choosing are applied to the data pool. Lastly, the researcher interprets the results. The researcher examines and explains their findings and also identifies study limitations. A conclusion is formed. The researcher makes recommendations for future research and consideration of implications of the finding on current nursing knowledge is applied. The following slides are a review of an experimental research study that was conducted on undergraduate nursing students. I'm sure many of you remember the stress of participating in a sim lab during undergrad. The purpose of the study was to analyze the effect of role assignment and high-fidelity patient simulation on junior-level nursing students. The study used a single factorial design with 5 levels and random assignment of groups at a public university-sponsored simulation lab. A random sample of 69 junior-level BSN students was used. These 69 students were randomly divided into 5 groups, or for this study, roles. Each role was a lead nurse, a secondary nurse, a documenter, medicator, and caller. Each participant completed a pre- and post-simulation critical thinking and self-efficacy assignment. The study aimed to review if random role assignment was more effective on these students' critical thinking and self-confidence during simulation, opposed to allowing the students to choose their own role. The research found that role assignment did have statistically significant effect on critical thinking skills, as well as on self-efficacy. There was no statistical significance found in situational awareness. These researchers used the Krustal-Wallis test to evaluate statistical significance. As with all research studies, there are limitations. This particular study utilized researcher-developed data collection and scoring methods that had not been vigorously tested by other researchers. Therefore, their reliability and validity is not clear. It also takes a great deal of time dedicated to a research study to ensure accuracy and validity. The researchers at this sim lab felt that time constraints and lack of funding refrained them from using commercially developed and validated methods that would have better served their study. That wraps up our presentation on experimental research studies. We hope you all enjoyed it, and we're looking forward to your questions on this week's discussion board.